Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Sports Lock Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Mosteller, and today we have the NFC East Fantasy Football Preview. We are only one more preview away before the sleepers, rankings, and busts coming out here in less than 2 weeks to prepare you for your NFL fantasy football drafts. If you haven't watched my other videos, please check it out on Spotify and YouTube at Sports Lock Podcast. So let's get into the NFC East. It's always a very interesting division to look at. Last year, the standings went as this. The Cowboys won the division at 12-5. The Eagles second at 11-6. The Giants third at 6-11. And the Commanders fourth at 4-13. If you've been following along with my division rankings and predictions of records from the prior season, it's kind of been off in some areas, but I was pretty spot on with the NFC East. Although I had the Eagles winning the division at 12-5, I did have the Cowboys at 12-5. I did have the Giants at 6-11 and the Commanders at 4-13. If you don't believe me, go check out the 2023 NFC East Fantasy Football Preview. But we did pretty well there, and we're looking to continue that streak here today. So let's take a look at the Dallas Cowboys. 12-5. Last year, they won the division. Unfortunately, they lost in the wild card round, 48-32 to the Green Bay Packers. Their key addition this year is getting back their running back, Ezekiel Elliott. He took a season off and went to the Patriots. Now he's back with Dallas. We'll talk about him momentarily, but first we're going to talk about the quarterback, Dak Prescott, who finished an amazing year as QB3 with over 4,500 passing yards, which was third best amongst quarterbacks. 36 touchdowns, which was first best, and 9 interceptions. An amazing stat line here. This was also his most yards and second most touchdown passes in his career. So a career season for Dak. How does he come off that career season? Well, I think it'll be hard for him to maintain that stat of 36 touchdowns, 9 interceptions. He's well capable of it. When people come off career years, they usually don't match it with another career year. He's also dealing with an ankle injury and the unknown status of Ceedee Lamb's extension. We'll talk about that here momentarily as well. But I do see a slight drop off. Nothing significant. I just think there's more upside in some other quarterbacks that you might want to take a chance on. But certainly, if you're a guy that's waiting on a quarterback, Dak Prescott is somebody that you could look at that I'd be really happy to get somewhere later in rounds. ESPN is QB8. He's my QB6. So I am a little bit higher than most. So I like Dak. I think once we find out what happens with Ceedee and how bad the ankle injury is, I think QB6 is right where he should go. Obviously, if Ceedee decides that he's going to hold out or ask for a trade and this injury is a lot worse, he's going to move further back down, maybe closer to QB10. But as of today, he's my QB6. Running back Ezekiel Elliott. Obviously, I said that he's returning to Dallas after 7 years with Dallas, taking the year to go to New England. Now he's back. He only started 5 games last year, but averaged 42 yards per game and 5 receptions for 31 yards and 9 total touchdowns. He was on pace to finish as an RB7. So Zeke, if he was healthy, was looking great, especially in the passing game. That is where he really set himself apart. And we will see if they utilize that the same way in Dallas. But I think he's a huge sleeper. He might be one of my biggest sleepers this year. I know last year Adam Thielen was my biggest sleeper, and look at what he did. Not expecting him to finish top 20, but certainly not, wide receiver 60 plus, whatever they had him at. So this year so far, I think Zeke's going to be my big sleeper. He has no competition really in Dallas. Rico Dowdell, you could make an argument about, but it's going to be Zeke as the starter. He's going back to his team, and I know he struggled with Tony Pollard there 2 years ago, but I think Zeke's going to be determined this year. It's crazy that ESPN has him as RB32. I know it's because of his age, most likely, and going into his 9th year, but I do think he finishes higher than that. I think I have him a lot higher as an RB15. It should probably be a little bit lower, but guys like Aaron Jones, guys like Josh Jacobs, people like that are going way ahead of Ezekiel Elliott, and I think they're on the same level. So maybe not quite RB15, but if you can get him where he's going as the RB32, he is an absolute steal in this year's draft. Talk about wide receivers, Ceedee Lamb and Brandon Cooks. Lamb finished as a wide receiver 1 and the number 1 overall player in fantasy last year. Kind of a surprise to some. He was about a wide receiver 7 or 8, I believe, on the board. He had 135 receptions, which was first, 1,749 yards, which was just a few yards behind Tyreek Hill, and 12 touchdowns, which was second. Cooks, if we take a look at him, finished wide receiver 38 with 54 receptions, 657 yards, and a whopping 8 touchdowns. Let's talk about Ceedee Lamb for a minute because he is holding out so far on a contract extension. And so far, as of today, which is August 18th, we have not heard anything about him signing at all. Now, I do expect that he does sign. And if he does, I expect it to be here within the next week or so. I don't see Ceedee not playing the first game of the season because of a contract. I think he's going to play. I think he's better than that. He doesn't really need the preseason, right? He probably wouldn't have played anyways. So I don't think that this is going to affect him too much, but definitely come draft day, even if you're drafting now, I would lean a little more caution, maybe go after a guy like Tyreek Hill instead of Ceedee, if this is the case where he's going to hold out a little bit. So we do have time, but again, as of today, when I'm recording this, Ceedee Lamb has not signed the contract extension. But if he figures it out, he's easily my wide receiver 1. If he doesn't figure it out, then I'm bumping Tyreek ahead of him, and he's my wide receiver 2. Cooks, he's going around wide receiver 62. I think it's because of a whopping 8 touchdowns last year. I don't think he's going to reach that this year. Maybe 5 or 6, but a guy around wide receiver 62 that could be a sleeper, especially if he puts up the numbers he did last year. Finally, tight end Jake Ferguson had an amazing year last year, tight end 9, 71 receptions, 761 yards, and 5 touchdowns. I think you see similar numbers, maybe a little drop off on the receptions, but otherwise he's right around where I have him, where he's finished last year. He's my tight end 9, ESPN tight end 10. Again, I think that the tight ends are a little more deeper this year. I think I've talked about it in a few of the podcasts here. I think that if you snag a guy like Ferguson, I wouldn't be upset at where he's going at his ADP. I believe overall he's like pick 100 or something like that, around that area, an overall draft. So if you're getting value in wide receivers and running backs early and you wait for Ferguson, he's not a bad pick. Finally, the defense was second last year. They're always a top defense led by Micah Parsons. The pros are that they do have that amazing defense and a solid offense returning. The cons are going to be looking at some of the offense there. Is Ceedee going to sign? I expect that he does. Is Ezekiel Elliott washed? I don't think he is. And is Dak Prescott healthy? Maybe he's a little banged up, but I think that won't affect him too much this season. So with that being said, I think they even get one game better. They go 13-4 this year. Last year they went 12-5, and that's what I projected. I do think they go 13-4 and will again be competing with Philadelphia for the division. Take a step back here and talk about the New York Giants. 6-11 last year, 3rd in the division. Their big ads were running back Devin Singletary from Houston, and they drafted wide receiver Malik Neighbors from LSU with the 6th overall pick. Daniel Jones, why do we even have to talk about this guy? He is pathetic, and if you saw the game yesterday, 2 interceptions. Daniel Jones is just a god-awful quarterback, and he should be considered a little bit better as he goes along in his career, but he's actually getting worse, which is insane. He only played in 6 games, though, last year and averaged 151 yards. He only averaged 0.3 touchdowns per game and 1 interception per game, which is terrible, that touchdown interception ratio. This would have had him on pace to finish as a QB 29. He's a guy that nobody should be drafting. If you're drafting Daniel Jones, you're insane. Right now, ESPN has him as QB 23, which means in a 12-man league. If you're drafting 2 QBs, he may be taken. He's my QB 26. I think you take a risk on some other guys that are sitting on the outside there. Some of these rookies, maybe even like Gardner Minshew, who's now announced as a starter for the Raiders. Even guys like that. Russell Wilson is a lot lower too. I would rather have over Daniel Jones. So if you're drafting Daniel Jones, I think that is probably the biggest mistake that you can make in fantasy football this year. No more Saquon Barkley. Now they go and get Devin Singletary, signed with New York after last season being in Houston. He finishes the RB 32 with 898 yards and 4 touchdowns. In the game started, he was on pace to finish as the RB 15. Now, the Giants do have a terrible offensive line, but when you have a terrible quarterback, you got to go to your running back. So to me, he's a little bit higher on ESPN. He's my RB 26, ESPN RB 34. That could adjust after yesterday's game. Singletary just couldn't get it going. Again, my rankings, Sleepers and Bust podcast will come out here next week. And when that comes out, those rankings could be moved a little bit around. So I think he may drop close to RB 30 for me. But I think somewhere around where I have him to RB 35 is where he'll be. Malik Neighbors finished his junior year at LSU with 800, that'd be insane, 89 receptions, almost 1,600 receiving yards and 14 touchdowns. This year, it just sucks that he's got to play with Daniel Jones. He's an elite wide receiver, and with any other quarterback, he'd probably succeed. But because of that, he's my wide receiver 34. I think he's going to be a bust only because of the quarterback situation. ESPN, again, a lot higher on him, just like they are Daniel Jones. But he is moving in a negative way backwards on draft boards because of that. So he's a guy that I'm not really going to be looking to target. I would rather take some other guys with some upside on other teams. It's just insane what wide receivers they have right behind him that are just proven guys. Daniel Bellinger, last year, the tight end, had 25 receptions for 255 yards. I think he'll have at least 1 or 2 touchdowns, but he's still around tight end 30. Again, not a guy that I'm going to be looking to draft. Finally, the defense is not bad. They were top 15 last year. I think some of the pros are that their defense can improve, but their offense is not going to get any better. That being said, I think this team is just going to have a tough year. Last year, they were 6-11. That's what I projected. This year, I think they go 3-14. I think they're one of the worst teams in the NFL. And they're just going to be shown this year that they need to make some big changes in New York. Now we can talk about a better team, the Philadelphia Eagles, that went 11-6, second in division last year, but got destroyed in the wild card round against Tampa Bay 32-9. Their key additions was obviously adding running back Saquon Barkley, which was an insane move from them. They do lose DeAndre Swift, but do pick up Barkley. Jalen Hurts, he finishes a QB2 with 3,858 yards, 23 touchdowns, and 15 interceptions. So the passing game there with the touchdown interception ratio is something that Hurts needs to work on. But here is where he's beneficial. He added 605 yards on the ground, which was first amongst quarterbacks, and 15 touchdowns, which was tied with Josh Allen for the most amongst quarterbacks. Now, I think that Hurts is going to be throwing the ball more. I think he does adjust that touchdown interception ratio. That's what he's got to work on. I don't see the rushing numbers being that high. I think those rushing touchdowns come way down with a guy like Saquon Barkley in the backfield, but still good enough for me to be a QB2. ESPN has him there. That's where I have him. I think people could argue that he could be QB1. I think there could be argument that he could maybe drops to QB3 or 4. But a solid quarterback, if you get him, he's going to be reliable because he does have that rushing upside. Let's talk about Saquon Barkley here. He missed 3 games last year, but finished with 962 yards and 6 touchdowns on the ground. So he was due for a 1,000-yard season. He also had 41 receptions for 280 yards and 4 receiving touchdowns, which was best for RB13. Now he's on a much better offense. He has a much better offensive line, which is why he is being drafted so high this year, because he is one of the best running backs talent-wise in the league, if not the best. And I think he could easily finish as the RB1 this year if he stays healthy on this offense. I think he's going to get the receptions. He's going to get the rushes. He'll have a line that'll block for him better than he did in New York. But I'm taking him as my RB4. That is exactly where ESPN has him. I think it's properly rated. I think that that's probably a very safe spot to put him. The wide receivers, A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith, were both top 20 fantasy wide receivers, with Brown finishing as a wide receiver 5. He did fall off a little bit at the end of the season, but overall, 106 receptions, almost 1,500 yards and 7 touchdowns, where Devonta Smith finished as a wide receiver 19 and he had 81 receptions, over 1,000 yards, and 7 touchdowns. Now, I think Brown's production is going to fall off a tad. I don't think he's as high as a wide receiver 5, but I don't think it's going to be such a drop off where he's finishing terrible. So for me, I think wide receiver 6 is fair. I think that connection with Hurts comes back, and the running game will open up the passing game a lot with Saquon Barkley. So he is my wide receiver 6, as does ESPN have him there. I think Devonta Smith stays around the same. Again, they may throw to the running back a little bit more with Saquon, but Smith will still get the looks. I think that stat line is a pretty good stat line for Devonta to go for. I don't think he has that big of a ceiling or that low of a floor. I think right where he's at is where he's going to be. So he's my wide receiver 19, ESPN wide receiver 19. I have him up as my wide receiver 18. Dallas Goedert finished as a tight end 13, 59 receptions, 592 yards, and 3 touchdowns. He did miss 3 games, but in looking at the stat line, he really wouldn't have moved up that much. I think he's still a reliable tight end. A lot of options now in Philadelphia for Jalen Hurts. So I think right around tight end 12 for me, ESPN tight end 13 is a really good spot to draft a guy like Dallas Goedert. Not too much upside with Goddard, though. I think when you're drafting a tight end as your starting tight end, if you're going with a guy that's a little bit deeper, you want somebody with a little more upside, like a Brock Bowers in that area. But Goddard is still going to be right around the same stat line, in my opinion. Defense was bad last year. That's something they need to improve on, and I think they went with that in the draft in the offseason. They're looking that way to improve that defense. That's probably their only con. Their pro is that they're one of the best offenses in the league. Last year, 11-6. I projected 12-5. I think they do get to 12-5 this year. And finally, the Washington Commanders, who got last in the division, 4-13. They do add Jaden Daniels, who they drafted 2nd overall from LSU. They did also add running back Austin Eckler from the Chargers, and they did add tight end Zach Ertz from the Arizona Cardinals. Let's talk about Jaden Daniels. He has a lot of upside. He was a phenomenal rusher as a quarterback. He could easily be this year's Anthony Richardson as long as he stays healthy. To me, he's a QB 16. I'm just always hesitant on drafting rookie quarterbacks. So I'm always lower on him. He could easily finish as a top 5 quarterback with that rushing upside. He doesn't have a bad offense around him, and we're going to talk about that offense here in a minute. But I'm just conservatively going to be drafting him as my QB 16. Again, I'm just not a guy that's going to draft rookie quarterbacks. If I do have a solid quarterback that I draft in my first round that I really like, such as a Jalen Hurts or a Patrick Mahomes, I may take the risk on a Jaden Daniels just as a backup because there could be some upside there. The running backs are going to be running back by committee, Brian Robinson Jr. and Austin Eckler. Now, we know how amazing Austin Eckler was with the Chargers, but last year he had one of his worst seasons ever. 628 yards, 5 touchdowns, and 51 receptions for 436 yards and a touchdown. A lot of people drafting him in the first round, but he finished as the RB26. Now, Brian Robinson finished as the RB21 with 733 yards, 5 touchdowns, and 36 receptions for 368 yards and 4 touchdowns. So where does it go this year? I think they're going to use both. I think Robinson will be the starter, but it's going to be kind of a running back by committee like we see in Pittsburgh. One drive's Najee, one drive is Warren. I think that's how it's going to be like here with Robinson leading the way. Both, I think, should be a little bit lower. I hate the running back by committees. Although you see in Pittsburgh that it can work with, 2 top 30 fantasy running backs. I think that these 2 will be a little bit worse than that. So Robinson for me is my RB31, ESPN RB26. Austin Eckler, RB32 for me, ESPN RB33. So just really close with these 2 there. It's hard to say who will be the better running back. Wide receiver Terry McLaurin, I think, can be a big sleeper this year. He finished wide receiver 29 with 79 receptions, over 1,000 yards, and 4 touchdowns. And now you get a guy like Jaden Daniels that they took 2nd overall throwing to him. I think he's going to add a few more touchdowns as well. I think he can have at least 6. maybe 8 touchdowns. And with that being said, I think he has top 20 wide receiver upside. I'm taking him as my wide receiver 26. ESPN, the wide receiver 33. A sleeper in Terry McLaurin, I really like this year. Finally, tight end Zach Ertz only played in 7 games last season, but has always been a solid tight end. I think he should receive a few touchdowns. He can be a sleeper, not a guy that's really going to be drafted, though, somebody you'll keep an eye on the waiver wire. So he's my tight end 27, ESPN tight end 34. And their defense was terrible. It was last year. Obviously, that con is a huge con. They're the worst defense in fantasy. I hope that they can change that around, because a few years back they were one of the top defenses in fantasy. But some of the pros are that they are improving their offensive position. So last year, 4-13, that's what I projected. I think this year they go 6-11. They win 2 more games. I think they have a schedule that can fare to that. And they're just kind of a mid to average team, but on the come up. And in the next few years, hopefully getting back to the playoffs. So let's get to my NFC East sleepers and busts. Where do we go here? Well, I talked big on Ezekiel Elliott at the start of this. I just think that with him coming back to that Dallas offense, the way he played it in New England last year, I think he has a lot of potential. I do see why people are going to be hesitant on drafting a guy like Zeke because of his age and because of his last season with Dallas not being that great. But I see it as a chance to prove himself once again. I see it as a chance of no Tony Pollard there. And I do think he has a lot of upside and is a big sleeper. Devin Singletary is a slight sleeper for me this year. I do think that although the offensive line is terrible, that's going to be a guy that they're going to look to go to, and he really has no competition there in New York. And finally, Terry McLaurin. I think with the quarterback upgrade and only having 4 touchdowns last year, I think he boosts that up to at least 6 to 8, which could put him closer to a top 20 wide receiver. So Terry McLaurin is a sleeper and somebody I'm going to be looking at in drafts. The busts, I think, are Daniel Jones easily and Malik Neighbors. I just think because of Daniel Jones, unfortunately, Malik Neighbors has to be that bust, being taken as a wide receiver 24. If he had a better quarterback, maybe he then deserves a top 25 spot, but not until they get somebody better in New York. And here are my final standings for the 2024 NFC East. I have the Cowboys winning it at 13-4. The Eagles in second at 12-5, the Commanders at third at 6-11, and the Giants in fourth at 3-14. That's a podcast for this week. Thanks for listening in. If you haven't listened to the past videos, make sure you do so on Spotify or YouTube and subscribe on there at Sportslock Podcast. Also on Instagram and TikTok at Sportslock Podcast. Make sure to follow, as I'll be posting more videos throughout the season. This upcoming week, we will have the final draft preview of the NFC West. And then the following week, it'll be the rankings, sleepers, and busts podcast. Make sure to check into that. Thank you for the love and support. And we'll see you guys this upcoming week.